Okay, everybody. So the final debate is behind us. Goodbye to all that. And gonna share a few fleeting thoughts with you, having, of course, sat through the entire thing out of some high-minded or not sense of obligation. And one thing that occurred to me in the portion of the debate, probably around a half hour to 45 minutes into it, was there was a section where both Trump and Biden were lobbing almost random accusations of corruption against one another. Trump repeats this line that I think I had only heard for the first time when he started mentioning it recently, which is that Biden's taken money from the mayor of Moscow. Biden returns with accusations that Trump has taken Russian money, all kinds of allegations of foreign influence being peddled upon both candidates. And sitting through that segment, I, as somebody who follows the news pretty assiduously, I would say, definitely far more than the average person, for better or worse, even I had to kind of strain at times to comprehend what the heck they were talking about. So if you are not an assiduous consumer of news, if you're just a casual observer, if you have peripheral interest in the presidential race, maybe you'll vote, maybe you won't, but it's not like an object of obsession for you day after day, then I have a hard time believing that you would have been able to comprehend like 30%. 30% would be the maximum amount that you'd have been able to comprehend about that portion. Because it was all sort of random and scattershot. It's hard for me even to recall the specific allegations off the top of my head because it was so, scrambled. And so how I sort of, cheekily summarized it was, okay, what did I hear there? That Abraham Lincoln has a laptop from hell that's both racist and Russian? Because it all kind of just mixed together in this incomprehensible stew of random allegations. And Abraham Lincoln got mixed in there because he was sort of just almost brought up out of nowhere toward the end when the corruption allegations got resurfaced. And Trump clearly had an agenda to bring up the newest details around Biden's potentially corrupt business dealings via Hunter that had come to greater knowledge as a result of these materials drawn from Hunter Biden's purported laptop. But again, there's almost no context for the casual news consumer to understand what Trump was trying to convey there. And likewise for a lot of the Biden accusations. So I don't know how effective, quote unquote, that really is, except to just bring down the entire campaign edifice into just this vague sense of mutually alleged corruption and morass. As far as the pundits who, if you just glance at Twitter right now, are confidently proclaiming who they think, quote, won the debate, I have long said this. I said this in 2016 when Hillary was widely declared to have won the debates. I said this in 2012 when Romney was widely declared to have won at least that first debate. These proclamations of certitude as to who you, a pundit or whomever, think won the debate are totally meaningless. First, you have to spell out what you actually mean by who won. Do you mean who performed better just on a sheer competency basis in terms of communication skill? Okay, that's one possible metric. I don't know how relevant it is. But you could also have the debate mean who delivered a performance that made it more likely that they will win the election. And in service of that goal, the candidates can have like non-overlapping goals, meaning Biden can have a goal to say things in the debate that energize certain voters or motivate certain voters who were not trying to decide between Biden and Trump, right? Whereas Trump could have a goal to motivate certain voters who maybe were deciding between Biden and Trump or were swing voters. So there's a whole variety of different constituencies that you can appeal to over the course of a debate that don't really lend itself to this easy bifurcated win/loss formulation. And so I never find it helpful to engage in that. It's almost like a sporting style framework to process events like presidential debates. And yeah, it's fun. It's almost like a parlor game. You can engage with in it if you want. But to me, it's tedious. And this is not anything really specific to this debate or even this year, but it's a recurring trend from these supremely self-confident pundits who think that they have the expertise to impart upon you how you should feel about the winner or the loser of the debate. I mean, it's just silly. It's mumbo jumbo. And I started off with the question with the issue of those accusations of corruption, because if you were aware of what the heck they were talking about, chances are that you're an informed enough news consumer that you probably already have a strong partisan preference, or you probably know what your voting outcome is going to be at this point. So in terms of late deciders, I think what the Trump people and Trump himself are trying to replicate is the waning days of 2016, when they think, I think probably fallaciously, that the surprise issuance of the so-called Comey letter, which if you look at the chronology of the election, that letter would have been issued the equivalent of tomorrow or Friday, in relation to how many days it happened before the election occurred in 2016. So maybe they're trying to angle for some replication of that. Again, I don't think that has anything to do whatsoever. I don't think the political strategy or lack thereof that Trump and his campaign are trying to implement at this point bears any relation to whether the media, journalists, etc., should join in this effort to dismiss and discount the Hunter Biden materials as somehow Russian disinformation. Clearly, they should not. They should independently assess the veracity of the information and not lapse into this mindless regurgitation of partisan talking points, which Biden clearly did in this debate, or at least self-interested talking points. One of Biden's top campaign operatives prior to the debate put out a statement that essentially laid out how he was going to address it, which is that he was just going to discount the entire thing as Russian disinformation. He was going to cite the 50 former intelligence officials who put out this bogus open letter stating without evidence that it was all Russian disinformation. And note, when they call it Russian disinformation, they don't actually dispute that the materials drawn from the hard drive are authentic. They do this pivot where they could just utter the phrase Russian disinformation, and everybody's supposed to assume that they're not authentic, but they've never issued a straight up denial as to the authenticity of the documents or the other materials. So that's a pretty strong indication that the materials probably are in fact authentic. And if they were not, well, it defies all reason to say that you would allow forgeries in your name to simply circulate for now well over a week and not just come and say, hey, these are forgeries. These are not from me. If you or I had forgeries going out in our name, I'm pretty sure the most natural reaction, the most justifiable reaction we'd have without even thinking much about it would be to say, hey, these are forgeries. These are not from me. And nobody associated with the Biden campaign or Biden himself has said that. And Biden had every opportunity to say that at this debate, and he studiously avoided it by pivoting to the so-called disinformation charge. And so that was, to be expected, foolish, whatever. But at the same time, I'm not sure that the way Trump has framed and contextualized the issue is sufficiently selling it enough that anybody who's already not a news junkie knows what he's talking about. Whereas with the Hillary emails episode, that had really developed over a long stretch of time. Hillary had been assuring everyone that the investigation was closed and that she was no longer facing any liability from the email server investigation. Then sure enough, with 11 days or so, however many days it was before the election, a letter is issued saying that, whoopsie daisy, the investigation is back open again. So the matter had not been resolved. Whereas with the Biden Ukraine stuff, or even the Biden hard drive stuff, some of which has nothing to do with Ukraine, it's other business dealings, it's kind of less contextualized. It's less punchy. It's less tied to any digestible narrative. And partly that's Trump's own fault, because he and his establishment Republican advisors have been telling him that the best strategy up until now to take down Biden was to say that he was a Trojan horse to the radical left. And I guess they've moved on from that, or at least they're not emphasizing it as much anymore. They're pivoting to the corruption angle, which is probably a better choice. It's more reminiscent of how they successfully campaigned against Hillary in 2016. But if you've spent months saying that Biden is just going to usher in a resurgence of the radical left, then that doesn't provide the lead up context that you would need to make a series of attacks like these that are based on the corruption allegations potent. So that's my impression. And again, my impression of the political efficacy of that has nothing to do with the journalistic imperative to not propagandize the public and tell them that these materials are all the product of Russian disinformation, or that if you believe them, that you're complicit in a Russian disinformation effort. It doesn't mean that the interventions by, for example, the big tech companies to censor these materials, to punish people who shared them on their accounts, is in any way justifiable. It's not in any conceivable respect. In fact, it's an unbelievable encroachment by those tech companies into free speech on the flimsiest of bases. So you kind of have to be a little bit careful how you parse out these issues. I think the most egregious moment that stood out to me was in what was called the national security portion of the debate. The national security portion of the debate is when they were leveling these accusations back and forth. So it wasn't really about foreign policy per se, although they did get to North Korea. And then Biden made the statement that I thought was the most egregious of the night of either candidate, which is that he compared Kim Jong-un to Hitler as a means by which of deriding Trump for meeting with Kim Jong-un, which I strongly doubt Biden would ever do, given that Trump doing that, given that direct diplomacy with Kim Jong-un is now associated with Trump. And of course, we can't in any way validate any of Trump's tactics or diplomatic strategies. So, declining to meet with Kim Jong-un, I think, would be misguided, but at least it's not as inflammatory as all of a sudden coming out and declaring him to be comparable to Hitler And what do you think that's going to do? What do you think the implications or consequences of that will be for the onset of a hypothetical Biden-Korea diplomatic relationship? It will have poisoned the well from the moment that Biden takes office. So the damage inflicted by that remark that Biden made will have to be repaired, and may will not be. So I think if Biden does enter office, I could easily see it worsening relations with North Korea, because I don't think they're gonna. I don't think they're gonna forget that Kim Jong-un was likened to Hitler. And remember, there's some deep-seated animosities on the Korean Peninsula toward Hitler, given that it's a North Korea is a Stalinist state. I'm not an expert on the history, but my impression would be that Hitler is not somebody who's valorized in North Korea, so it's a bad thing to have their leader compared to him so flippantly in their minds. And also, I mean, it's also just objectively stupid to make that comparison. Kim Jong-un has no capacity to carry out anything remotely like what Hitler carried out. So the comparison was ridiculous, and it's going to probably require it's probably going to occasion a diplomatic hurdle that was just unnecessary and born of Biden's insistence on blustering against Trump from the standpoint of accusing Trump of being insufficiently belligerent on the world stage. I mean, this is just a continuation of the longstanding Democratic line taken against Trump foreign policy, which is to say stuff like he's cozying up to dictators, he's in league with Putin, he's not standing up on the world stage against our adversaries. In fact, he's allying with them, which all boils down to that Trump is not aggressive enough with his foreign policy, which if you look at Trump's foreign policy, probably the last thing I would say about it is that it's been insufficiently aggressive. That's not the problem with Trump's foreign policy. Trump, as people point out, hasn't started a new war, although you could, make a case for his bombing of Syria, his bombing of Soleimani, etc., his escalations in Afghanistan, but he hasn't started a brand new conflict. And so the one thing that I would not say about Trump is that he's been insufficiently antagonistic or aggressive. I would make claims that are critical of Trump on the grounds of him not fulfilling his pledges to withdraw the American military presence around the world, which he, by and large, really hasn't done to any great degree. I watched recently, just out of curiosity, it's just a debate from 2000. 2004. So Bush Kerry. And in one of those debates, Bush was touting how he was going to be removing some troops from Europe because we no longer are required to have all the manpower there that had been required in the past during the Cold War. And Bush actually did. There were withdrawals of troops from Europe gradually over time over the past, 20, 25 years. And Bush did that. Obama did that. And Trump's doing that, maybe not all in the same manner, to the same degree, or with the same strategic aims, but they've been doing it to varying extents. And so, a rational critique of Trump would be to say, hey, look, Trump goes around boasting how tough he's been on Russia. He did that tonight, meaning he did stuff like arm Ukraine, which Obama didn't do. Whereas what Trump accused Biden of is just sending them pillows. You saw that issue litigated over the course of the impeachment episode. Trump touting sanctions against Russia. So the question in a rational political climate would be, hey, isn't this contrary to what you had campaigned on in 2016 in terms of how you would deal with Russia? I thought we were all going to be getting along with Russia, whereas what you're boasting about now in terms of your record is all about antagonizing Russia and fostering a new Cold War climate. And that can't happen for reasons that principally have to do with the blinkered American domestic U.S. Domestic political climate, which makes it almost an inevitability that if Trump did say anything like that, he would then be accused of still secretly conspiring with Putin somehow. So you can blame a variety of factors as to why those are the political incentives at play now, but nonetheless, they plainly contravene what Trump had campaigned on in 2016, and that's what would be rational to say about his posture now. But of course, it just can't be said because that's how demented things have become. And I think Putin must have spent the past 4+ years just laughing his behind off at how obsessed these dopey American politicians are with him, from Trump to Biden to everybody in between and everybody along the margins. Everybody's obsessed with Putin. It never ends. It was the same in 2016. And it's now in 2020 where we have theories being floated about why Trump hasn't stood up to Putin. Trump says he has stood up to Putin, blah, 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 blah. I mean, if Putin did sit in his bunker somewhere in, I don't know, Serbia and plot that they wanted to actually make Russia a central issue in U.S. politics, I mean, then he couldn't have planned it out better, because the fact that he has become such an obsession is more a projection of the anxieties and irrationality of the American political class than it is about anything that Putin himself has done. They need Putin as a hate object. As far as the moderator, I mean, I saw people swooning over her performance. I guess it was moderately competent, but then again, it was just this really predictable set of questions. At least she did, probably anger some Democratic partisans by asking Biden relatively pointed questions, or at least enough pointed questions that it was roughly comparable to how many that were posed to Trump, which, the MSNBC cheerleaders probably just wanted it to be 100%, chanting at Trump to disavow this or that group. But, to me, that she could be receiving such praise now is a marker of how low expectations are. And, American families as a topic, I mean, that's so ridiculously vague and meaningless. Asking the two elderly white men to reflect on how well they understand racism, or how well they understand the talk that young black boys are often given by their parents in terms of how to deal with police. It's all very schmaltzy stuff. Not that that's not a legitimate issue, but it's just phrased in a very tedious and predictable and almost obligatory way. And I don't know that it really deserves a whole lot of praise, because, it's just standard fare stuff. In terms of the COVID section at the beginning, I think we're almost dealing with on fallacious terms here, because it's kind of cast as this debate between locking down and opening up, as if the country is still, quote, locked down right now, which it's really not. So I don't think that you should just, if you want to argue that things that are currently shut down should be opened up, fine, but be more specific than just acting like it's this all-encompassing policy in place. Like Trump would say, for example, that Pennsylvania is locked down as though it's a prison state right now. I'm in Pennsylvania at the moment. I told you I'm in Scranton, and I'm moving around freely. I'm going into restaurants to pick up takeout. I'm going here and there. It's not locked down. And I almost think that lockdown was just a misnomer to describe these policy choices from the outset. I think there's a legitimate debate about schools. So if you think schools should open up, okay, let's debate that. I think that there's a reasonable case to be made that they should open up where they haven't, and that shutting them down is counterproductive. I don't know that I have a perfect solution to that issue. The point is that just we're almost dealing in this fantasy terrain of lockdown versus no lockdown. And I thought that was a little bit foolish. And it also, I have to say, is ironic to me that Trump began, the first thing he said tonight was that he bragged about how wonderful it was that he shut down the economy and saved millions of lives. He said the same thing in the 60 Minutes interview that he put out the full video of earlier today. And so if you've ever ventured into MAGA world, and there might be some of you in the comments here, you'll get the impression that Trump has been stridently and ferociously anti-lockdown the entire time. And to the extent that he acquiesced to any of it, it's because he was tricked by his scientific advisors like Fauci and whomever. Okay, if that were the case, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's say he was anti-lockdown all along and he was just swindled into it by these nefarious scientific advisors early on. Then why is he still bragging about doing the lockdown? I mean, you guys have such cognitive dissonance about Trump's lockdown position, and I get it. I'm not going to convince you. It reminds me of those initial anti-lockdown protests in the spring where you had got people waving Trump flags, suggesting that Trump wanted to open up, whereas the Democratic governors wanted to shut everything down. In the meantime, I remember at that same time as those protests were happening, you had Trump going on at his press conference and chastising the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, for what Trump said was prematurely opening the state back up for removing restrictions early enough, too quickly. The point is now we don't have stringently enforced shelter-in-place orders. We don't have anything that's really like a lockdown. And if you have specific objections to specific policies, such as school closures, such as bar and restaurant closures, okay, fine. Let's deal with those issues on the merits, or on a more narrowly tailored way than just pretending like the only issue here is lockdown versus lockdown. It seems a little stupid. Okay, that about does it. I'm gonna go see if I have any super chats here. SDFUFFF says, go search for change my ballot on Google Trends. I think that means nothing. Anghush says, enjoy your work. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, my good man. Estev, what do you mean when you meant Trump will be in a better position if he could alienate conservatives like Ben Shapiro? Oh, yeah. Okay, so a day or two ago, I think it was 2 days ago, Ben Shapiro put out a endorsement video, or essentially a video where he was saying that he was like melodramatic. I'm sorry, maybe this is not consistent on my part, but I find it so annoying when people, when pundits, whether online YouTube people or whomever, think that their individual voting preference is so very important that they have to spend a whole lot of time on meticulously and painstakingly explaining to people why they're voting the way that they did. Your individual vote is just not that important, Ben Shapiro, and that applies to a lot of other commentators and such on left and right. I think it takes a bit of myopia and self-aggrandizement to think that your vote, who you check on the box on the ballot, matters that much. Anyway, Ben Shapiro said that he melodramatically declared that he hadn't voted for Trump in 2016, but he's going to be voting for him in 2020 for X, Y, and Z reason. And the reason why I said that Trump would be in a better position if he had alienated, the way I phrased it was if he had continued to alienate Ben Shapiro, was because if he had continued to alienate Ben Shapiro, that means that he wouldn't have followed the conventional Republican agenda. That means that he would have actually followed through on some of the more heterodox impulses he expressed in the 2016 campaign that lifted him to victory. Or in other words, the heterodox worldview that Trump espoused during that time, which was not a conventional Republican worldview, had that been more translated into governance, then I think Trump would have been in a better position, because he was running on a lot of stuff that was pretty popular. And I'm sorry, yes, that would entail alienating some movement conservatives who are tethered to the old-fashioned, Reagan-esque free market, social conservatism, strong national defense, blah, blah, blah. So had Ben Shapiro been a little bit more alienated from Trump's actual governance, because it followed through on what Trump had pledged, granted often inchoately in 2016, then I think Trump probably could have broadened his coalition, and people who are more moved conservatives would maybe be compelled to vote for Trump regardless because of I said that. All right, that's it. That'll do it for now, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. We'll all make it through this final stretch together. So you know the deal. Stay safe, stay cool, blah, 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 blah.